Welcome back to Pivot Point. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore, and I am pleased to welcome Dean Baker to the show. Dean, welcome. Dean, are you there?
Yes, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear the music.
Okay.
How are you doing, Maya?
Okay, I'm well. How are you, Dean?
I'm doing well.
Listen, Dean, is sequestration going to go through?
That's a very good question. My guess is we're likely to see a very short period of sequestration, but I'll give the Obama administration credit. What they've proposed is that they're going to have some sequestration cuts that people are going to really feel. They're going to be very angry about, feel immediately, I should say, in the sense of they're talking about cutting air traffic controllers, which will lead to a lot of flight delays, cutting back security at the airport, which means, very, very long lines rather than just long lines. And my guess is that very quickly the Republicans will come to the table and be willing to accept something quite different. So I think we'll probably see that. We'll probably see it go into effect for a day or two, and then we'll get some very different package.
So do you think that the Republicans will be scared into coming to the table?
They're going to get a lot of pressure, and that's going to be across the board. I mean, these people are people are flying tend to be upper income people, business people. They're not going to be happy. You'll have flights canceled. People are counting on getting on a business trip, some cases a vacation. They can't do it. Waiting 2 hours at the security at airports. You can get a lot of people pretty angry, and given that the whole thing is really pointless, and they know this. I mean, everyone knows this. I mean, So my guess is you will get them to the table pretty quickly.
So, Dean, you wrote a piece for The Guardian recently talking about and making the case, as you eloquently do, and I've heard you do on many occasions, that we actually need to be expanding the deficit and the debt right now. Can you tell our listeners why?
Yeah, and this is one of the incredible absurdities. There's a myth that really both parties have perpetuated, that we've had an ongoing deficit problem. And the Democrats, of course, like to blame the Bush tax cuts, which I was never a fan of, also the wars, which, again, I also wasn't a fan of. Republicans create this myth of out-of-control spending. The reality is that we did not have an ongoing deficit problem. The deficits leading up to the collapse in 2008 were relatively modest. In 2007, it was just over 1% of GDP. We could run a deficit of that size literally forever. Now, one could argue we should have a balanced budget. You could argue we should have a surplus. But again, it wasn't a crisis. It was something we could have done literally forever. We got large deficits because the economy collapsed. That meant a big plunge in tax collections. We pay out more money for programs like unemployment insurance, other programs associated with supporting people who've lost their jobs. And then, of course, we did other stimulus that deliberately raised the deficit to boost the economy. Now, that's basically over now. That was 2009, 2010. 2011 pretty much faded to zero. By 2013, there's almost nothing there left. But we have a large deficit today, again, because the economy is weak. And had the economy stayed strong, we wouldn't have a deficit. And if we cut back the deficit, we're slowing growth, throwing people out of work. And I just don't see how anyone in their right mind would want to do that.
Well, indeed, we've seen from other nations that it's not a good course of action. I saw that this week that Moody's is downgrading the United Kingdom's credit rating, and they have pursued this austerity budget approach, haven't they?
That's exactly right. And the UK is probably the best example here because, like the United States, the United Kingdom has its own currency. Other countries, Italy, Spain, Greece, they had no choice. They don't have their own currency. It's like if Arkansas had a big deficit, Arkansas can't just, run large deficits. It's, it gets U.S. dollars, so it has to find a way to finance that. UK has its own currency, but they said, no, we're going to be responsible. A conservative government that won the elections in 2010, they decided they were going to cut back spending, have tax increases, bring their deficits down. And what it's done is it's thrown the economy back into a recession. They had a brief period of growth. It looks like they're back in recession now for a third time. And it's led to, because the economy contracts, it's actually made their deficits larger. It's a perverse effect that, when you slow your economy, that throws more people out of work. You're paying more in unemployment benefits, collecting less in taxes. And that's a consequence. Now Moody's is looking at UK and saying, hey, your debt situation looks really bad. Your economy's not growing, and that's why they downgraded them.
And yet, austerity, the myth of austerity as a solid course of action continues to play out here in America. And we, in our last segment, we just had Lisa Graves on, who talked about the role of Pete Peterson and Erskine Bowles and Simpson, et cetera, and the oversized and outsized role of these actors. Do you think that the conversation has been bought? Have we lost this argument, Dean?
Well, we haven't lost it. I mean, we haven't lost it for the simple reason that, the programs that these people want to cut, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, I mean, these are hugely popular programs across the board. And it's not just, a small group of liberals or Democrats who like them. They're popular among Tea Party conservatives, Republicans. So they have to find some backdoor ways to do it. That's why they're always coming up with these sort of convoluted schemes where we're going to have the super committee and an up or down vote, no amendments, this and that. They're trying to find some anti-democratic way to get through measures that, cuts that, just have no popular support anywhere in the political spectrum. So in terms of getting their agenda of austerity, I think they're going to have a hard time. But what is unfortunate is they've knocked off a serious discussion of how we're going to get people back to work. That is the real crisis. I mean, it's just an incredible story. We have whole communities that are being devastated. Families can't raise their kids properly. I mean, it really is an enormous hardship in this country not to have a job. And it's not, these people were working before the economy collapsed. So we're not talking about that. All we're talking about is how do we get the deficit down? And you now have these absurd debates where we're arguing what the debt-to-GDP ratio should be in 2023. You sort of want to grab these people and go, are you on this planet?
So, Dean, you're the president now. I've just made you the president of the United States. You won the election.
Yeah, good job.
What happens? What kind of job creation program would you put in place?
Well, we have a lot of infrastructure needs. This is something we should be addressing because, the basic story here is the private sector is not employing people. So usually, and I've had these discussions with conservative economists, I know their argument, you're pulling resources away from the private sector. And there's something to that when we're near full employment. If we go back to 2007, the unemployment rate's 4.5%. I go, hey, I want this huge infrastructure project. Well, they'd rightly say, well, is that going to be a better use of the money than if the private sector? Well, in this case, that's not an issue. So, addressing a lot of infrastructure needs, building our infrastructure for the next 40, 50, 60 years. We're still using the infrastructure today that was built in the New Deal.
I actually talked about that at the top of, I don't know if you know, but the theme of our show this week and last week and the week before has been called Third World America. And I have a friend who travels extensively around the Pacific Rim, and he says whenever he comes into LAX, he feels like he's flying into a third world country. The infrastructure is so bad. And so when you make the argument in the case that, infrastructure could be one way of promoting growth, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, I think it makes sense. Also, people have talked about education. We're cutting back. We should be building up. It's not easy, to improve the education system in the sense that, we have a lot of people from disadvantaged backgrounds. But, to my mind, this is kind of a twofer that we know if your parents are unemployed, kids are likely to do real poorly in school. They're not in stable households. Families are moving. That's really bad. You're in second grade. You're in school for 2 months, then you move to a whole new neighborhood. That's bad for performance. A lot of research on that. So on the one hand, if we spent more money in the sense of having teachers, making sure that we had, decent class sizes, we had good teachers in schools. The other hand, we're getting people back to work, so that's really a twofer, that if we could improve the quality of education in addition to infrastructure, this is a benefit we're going to see long into the future.
And yet we're facing sequestration, which will have an impact on at least federal K-12 spending.
That's right. I mean, there's a whole set of areas where we're going to be cut, and again, these areas have already been cut. So you're looking at state and local governments have been cutting really since 2010, and insofar as we see these sequestration cuts go through, we're going to feel that even more. Now, it's important to realize, 2013 is just the beginning. The story was we have a whole set of cuts that go into effect over the course of the next decade. So whatever we're seeing this year, that's just the beginning. At least, if we follow what's currently scheduled, there's going to be more coming next year and even more the year after that. So
where do revenues play? Do you think that you have argued for a financial transaction tax, a Robin Hood tax, whatever, and it just seems to me that that these conversations about revenue, raising revenue, it just seems to be that it's not gaining traction. And what do you think?
Well, it is quite striking that, in the Washington, kind of the serious people debate, what the Washington Post talks about, the idea of a financial speculation tax literally never gets mentioned, and it's treated like, it's this bizarre thing, like we're crazy people out there. And you're going, well, wait a second, we actually have that in the United States until the mid-'60s. The UK has that, which last time I looked wasn't communist. They have a tax of 0.5% on stock trades, and they raise the equivalent relative to their size of the economy of $30 to $40 billion a year, just taxing stock trades. They're not taxing derivatives, credit defaults. It's just stock trades. And you raise that here, and people look at you like, how can you talk about that?
And the EU, and then the EU just passed it last year.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up. That's right, exactly. We have 11 countries in the European Union, including Germany, France, Spain, Italy. So these aren't small countries that are in support of having a financial transaction tax within the EU. It doesn't have everyone. The UK doesn't want to have further taxes. The Netherlands is opposed, but you have, the biggest countries within the Eurozone are all behind this. So to treat this like it's a bizarre idea that, just crazy people would advocate, I think that really speaks volumes about the nature of our politics.
Dean, do you ever go to Davos? Were you at the World Economic Forum?
They haven't invited me.
They haven't. No, surprise, surprise, surprise. If you look at this situation realistically, then you're left on the outside. Actually, Dean, one thing that I think an epiphany that I recently had is that people seem to be more vested in the illusion than the reality. They don't want to hear the truth.
Well, I think that's certainly true, and it does certainly make it hard to make progress, because obviously we're only going to make headway insofar as we could get people to look at the reality and say, hey, look, we got to change things. They're going in the wrong direction.
Right. So this Third World America concept, in my eyes, we're headed down a path if we do not change this conversation, and if we don't get a hold of our political and policy apparatus to ensure that people are made whole and that people could actually afford to survive and thrive in this nation, that we will be heading backwards. And how does a minimum wage play into that?
Well, if you go back, and I'm going to confess to having not noticed this until literally a few weeks ago, if you go back to the early post-war era, the period from the end of World War II till the mid-'70s, the minimum wage kept up not just with inflation, but with productivity growth. And that clearly wasn't an accident. There was an idea, look, we want to make sure everyone shares in the gains of economic growth. Now, since the late 60s, the minimum wage hasn't even kept up with inflation. Mm-hmm. And the legislation President Obama proposed raising the minimum wage to $9 an hour. That's a great thing. We're talking about a pay increase of over $3,000 for lowest paid workers in the country. Hard to say that's a bad thing. But that doesn't even get us back to where we were in the late 60s, where we were, at this point 45 years ago. Whereas if the minimum wage had kept pace with productivity, in other words, that workers up and down the income ladder share in the gains of economic growth, the minimum wage today would be about $16.50 an hour. Really kind of an incredible thing to think about. That's more than 40% of all men get and more than 50% of all women get. We'd be in a very, very different country if that were the case. We've
lost a lot of ground. I recently went to a book signing for a friend of mine who wrote a book called Behind the Kitchen Door, and it's about the minimum wage, and many people don't know this, for restaurant workers, which is actually lower than the national minimum wage, and it's been stagnant for decades as well. And so, they're now pushing to actually peg the minimum wage for restaurant workers to the national minimum wage. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, no, this is an incredible thing. Again, it's one of these things that very few people, even a lot of people in policy debates, aren't aware of, that there's a separate minimum wage for tipped employees. And I forget when that last has been increased. I think it dates back from the mid-'80s. It's something like $3.50 an hour. I couldn't even tell you exactly what it is.
It's lower than that.
Lower than that,
yeah.
Okay. The presumption is that you're going to get that made up with your tips. And obviously, if you're working in an expensive restaurant and, people order big meals and whatever, that may be true. But for a lot of people that are working at, coffee shops, no, they're not making it up. And what that means is that you have a lot of people working in the restaurant sector that are getting considerably less than the minimum wage, which, it's really an incredible thing, because $7.25 an hour is not exactly living high on the hog.
Well, at the book signing, they had people, restaurant workers, who testify that when they get their pay stubs, it actually says this is not a payment, and it's actually negative because the taxes actually wipe away their base minimum wage. And they're just in dire straits, forcing them to do all kinds of things. So it's a terrible thing when people actually work in this country and they can't make it.
Yeah, and it's kind of striking. You go back and the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. It wasn't obviously we weren't a communist country. I mean it was very much a capitalist country. Companies were making big profits, but yet there was a consensus. You had Republicans that supported this too. That you didn't get a big difference. That you got Eisenhower in the White House and suddenly said, "Oh, we're never going to raise the minimum wage again." This is across the political spectrum. This idea that everyone should share in the gains of prosperity. And that idea has just disappeared, and we're getting this notion that somehow, if we're paying our workers more than we're paying them in the poorest country in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, wherever it might be, that somehow that we can't do that, which just an incredible story.
Dean, did you know Aaron Swartz?
Yes, I did, and it is a real tragedy. He's a brilliant kid and very committed, and the story, I have to say, I feel bad. I did know him, and I communicated with him. I knew of his arrest, of course. I had no idea of the charges he was facing. I mean, if your listeners don't know, he'd been downloading academic articles. His intention was to make them available to the public. So he downloaded, I believe it was hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of academic articles. He was going to make them freely available to people that anyone could click onto them without paying. And it's a violation of copyright law, no doubt about it. He got caught, and my assumption was, he's facing, a suspended sentence, something. But the prosecutors, federal prosecutors under the Obama administration, were pressing charges that could have put him in jail for decades.
For 30 years, I understand.
Yeah, and with this hanging over his head, he ended up committing suicide. Now, obviously, other issues there. I don't mean to say they, forced him to commit suicide, but as I say, it's just striking. I look at this, I go, here you have this young man that was trying to make information, academic work available to the public, and they could take the resources to press these charges. And then you look at the Wall Street banks who passed on tens of billions of dollars in fraudulent mortgages to enrich themselves, and not one of them has been charged.
Well, it reminds me, they seem to be going after the little guy in the mortgage brokers who were doing their thing. It seems like they're willing to press charges against them, but not the players who were actually pulling the strings.
Yeah, and just to be clear, because I've had people say, well, there was nothing illegal there. Well, it will vary, but the basic story here is if I'm at Citigroup, if I'm at Merrill Lynch, and I have a pile of mortgages that have all sorts of blatant improprieties in them, things that clearly don't make sense, and I just stuff them into a mortgage-backed security and sell them off wherever, that's fraud.
Right.
And could you prove that? I don't know. Is there any reason I think they tried? No.
So, Dean, I just want to ask you this last question. What do you think the state of capitalism is today? I mean, we seem to have this super capitalism on steroids, capitalism at all costs, making money at all costs, and the government seeming to aid and abet some of this. What is your take on where we are?
Well, I think we're in an unsustainable situation in the sense that these people just are not. There's no one who's doing long-term thinking. Go back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You had capitalism. People made plenty of money. That was a stable system. This is not a stable system. It wasn't a stable system before things blew up in 2008. It's not a stable system today. And the thing is, these people do not want to think about that. All they're doing is going, hey, profits are back to their pre-recession level. The stock market is back to where it was in 2007. Why are you bothering me?
So if you were president of the world, what kind of what changes would you make?
Well, think long term. Look, we lift people out of poverty after World War II in much of the developing world. We could move forward. I mean, one of the things I will look to and say is, really a great story in China. You've had huge improvements in living standards for large chunks of their population. I don't want to, sing the praises of the government. It's a dictatorship. Lots of bad things you could say about it, but there have been enormous improvements in living standards there. In many countries in Latin America. We could build on that, see those countries as friends rather than enemies. And, the problem we're facing today, it's really kind of an absurdity. We're poor because we have a lack of demand. What we have to do is get money into pockets of people who will spend it, and that will make us all better off. So it's utterly absurd that, we have so many people suffering from unemployment simply due to the fact we don't have enough demand in the world economy today.
Dean Baker, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Maya.
Well, that's it for another edition of Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore. As always, I'd like to thank my listening audience and my production team of Peter James Callahan, Rich Webster, and Courtney. Finally, I'd like to remind our listening audience to please join us live every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on weactradio.com or 1480 a.m. if you're in the Washington, D.C. area. Until next time, America.